But let's begin first here with a little bit of honorable mention action. And I think the first game that we have on the list here actually is one that Alex, you wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
It's Stalker 2.
Yeah, Stalker 2 for me, there's a reason why it's not on like the core list, but there's also reasons why I still want to talk about it. I think capturing the zone after more than 15 years since the original came out, the original with its X-ray engine, which for the time was really interesting in the aspect of that it had a lot of parallax mapping, real-time shadow cascades if you selected that option, and like some distance fog effects and stuff like that made the game look really atmospheric. And capturing that with extremely updated tech, Unreal Engine 5 years later, I still think it's actually a challenge in spite of everything, because getting it to feel like the original game, which is, kind of janky but beautiful at the same time. And they did that. The second game's got its jank in it, but it's also beautiful commonly when you're outside, just at any time of day. And I think that is really well done. And it's, the aspects that are really well done are typically the lighting and atmospheric effects, like the fog and whatnot. They generally look really, really great. But there are some aspects of it that do let some of the presentation down. For example, like the shadows in the game aren't so great. They don't seem to be using VSM for everything. Some of the level of detail handling isn't perfect. It's like an older version of Unreal Engine 5. So stuff like foliage it looks good up close usually, but when you walk through the world, it kind of like LODs in a way that is not so flattering, right? And there's a couple other things, like some of the indoor environments are a little bit sparse and Spartan in a way that surprised me at times. Like that's an aspect of like where I look compared to like the Metro series, and I'm like, oh, they actually did that better in Metro. So yeah, I think there's a lot that I like about it, but including like some of the things that are not so great, as well as some of the performance aspects, which are not so great. I just didn't think it was a top 10 list candidate, but still one that's gorgeous, and I think the team can be proud of in a lot of ways.
Cool. So I would agree. It is a handsome game, but it still has some limitations for sure. But I like what they did overall, and yeah, it does show the, I guess, potential of Unreal Engine 5 and its Lumen lighting system in action for sure. So yeah, cool. Another one I wanted to throw in the ring, Oliver, I think you originally covered this as well. Persona 3 Reload. And kind of the reason I want to put it on here is it's just such a gosh darn sharp presentation that perfectly executes the vision with like precision, right? It's just like I'm playing on PS5, and it's basically like this native 4K 60 FPS presentation. They actually snuck ray tracing in there in spots on all the glass reflections in certain areas, like mirrors specifically. But really, it's just like it fully realizes that sort of like anime aesthetic, but it's like it's so clean, crisp, sharp, smooth, and consistent. And then you have, of course, that team's they have a penchant for amazing menu systems and UI design, and all of that stuff really shines through. And now it feels like it perfectly jives with the visuals, and it's just like perfectly realizes that vision that they went for. And I found that really compelling. Plus, it's just an awesome game, and I actually missed Persona 3 back in the day. I started with Persona 4 basically. So I really enjoyed it a lot. It was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the game has a lot of really strong visual high points, like those menus, the kind of water backgrounds and the watery UI stuff, and the kind of clean and engaging look with the blue and white theme there. I think it's pretty cool. I also really like the combat animations as well, which I think are really top-notch, especially for those like theurgy moves. They're definitely probably the best I've seen in any Persona title to date. And the character models all look really, really sharp, really, really crisp. Like you mentioned, the game generally runs at like 4K 60 with RT reflections, which is pretty intense. So you get that really crisp silhouettes and really fine detail. It's very, very sharp. Even on a PS5, Series X, whatever, it looks very sharp. Ray traced reflections are very nice. Cutscenes are great. There are some elements to it that I'm not 100% in love with, like some of the environmental lighting. it's kind of a little weird. Some of the environments can look a little stark. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, in my personal opinion. But overall, I mean, to me, this is a game that's going to show up on my best games of the year list for sure. And it's a game that I really, really enjoyed playing, and I really just love what they've done in terms of the stylization of the game, not just visually, but also in terms of the music and just the way that everything presents. I think it's like a really confident and self-assured game that I had just an absolute blast with. So for sure, it deserves an honorable mention here.
Heck yeah, I agree, 100%. But while we're on that train, Oliver, you also wanted to throw in another similar looking game in a way, although with the lack of anti-aliasing, it's kind of like, but it's Metaphor ReFantasio, right?
Yeah, I think you have like that really bold UI design here as well, but it's totally different. Where you have like this like Renaissance-inspired iconography, like these weird like bold paint textures and things like that. It's kind of an interesting mix of kind of old and new there. And you have kind of this more painted look where you have these like paint over style things that keep going through different cycles there and giving you that kind of animated paint style effect in the characters there. And I think it is pretty visually striking, but there are some like bigger weaknesses, I would say, in Metaphor. In particular, the game's configuration on consoles is not that flattering in terms of the aliasing presentation, in terms of the frame rate, unless you go to PS5 Pro where it kind of cleans things up, but that shouldn't have been probably necessary there for it to look like this. And I think that like it has a bit of a more realistic, slightly more gritty style. And you start to see some of those weaknesses in the old engine they have there, basically, which is the Persona 5 engine, just updated. Whereas like in Reload, they're using UE4, and you kind of get like a lot of things for free, like a lot of the nice post-processing. The ray tracing, obviously, is quite nice that you don't see in Metaphor. So it's kind of one of those games where I think the UI design is really striking. What Atlas does with UI is always really exciting, but the rest of the game, it's kind of like, well, there's some parts that I'm not as fond of, let's say.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah, same.
I'm actually really excited to play that one though. That was one of the games I did not get a chance to play yet this year, but I have it. And I will play it at some point. But you know how these games take a while to play through. I don't know. Is this one a little more reasonable in terms of length, or is it still like gigantic?
I think it's like 80, 100.
Oh my gosh, no!
Too long.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I still want to play it. I will. Next on the list, I've just made the executive decision to chime in on this, and I think Alex, you can contribute to this as well. I just want to do a blanket shout out to Night Dive Studios again this year, because these guys are on fire in terms of just releasing stuff, and I mean on fire in a good way, not the this is fine way. It's so they put out Dark Forces Remastered, Star Wars game.
Oh my gosh, that was this
PO
year.
Definitive Edition. They put out Doom and Doom 2, which seems like it would be nothing on the surface, but it was awesome. They put out Killing Time Resurrected, and then they just released The Thing Remastered. And like pretty much across the board, I believe if you're playing on consoles, they're all like 4K 120 FPS. They're good on PC. It's just like Night Dive continuing to do what they do best, right? They perfectly remaster these games to bring them to a new generation, but fix any of the sort of lingering tech problems and find like sort of the idealized way to display them. Like you look at something like PO'd, for instance, which was a 3DO and PS1 game previously, very limited, always very interesting, but being able to play that at a full smooth frame rate now, like an obscure game like that, like I love that they were able to release that. And I think we're actually we're doing something on The Thing as of this recording as well, right, Alex?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a game we're going to try and do a little bit of coverage of before the year ends. And I'll agree with John. I think taking old games and actually making them be presentable on modern sets and at fluid frame rates is a challenge of its own and requires a lot of finesse, actually. And that's something that Night Dive typically does way better than almost every other studio that releases games, older games, especially things from like the mid 90s. Most people don't do that very well at all. As we found out, typically John has a strongly worded video here or there about how they did things poorly. But Night Dive definitely deserves some credit this year.
Absolutely. Great job, guys. And I didn't even mention the fact that the System Shock remake from last year, which made
that
my
was
Game of the
ported, right?
Year list last year, came to consoles this year.
Right. Now, before we go on to another candidate for our honorable mentions, I would like to insert a smaller one that I covered this year as an honorable mention as well, called Tiny Glade. Now, this game arguably could also be in the top 10, but we already had a kind of full list, so it just going to end up here in the honorable mentions. And the reason why I wanted to select this game for honorable mentions is because, kind of like a title that John will be talking about later in the top 10, it is using primarily custom technology, and it is also pushing a lot of advanced effects. It's using software ray tracing for diffuse lighting and specular reflections. It is using some really cool technology to make its procedural environments actually work. Like when you place things and they kind of automatically adjust and shape themselves based upon the kind of surrounding areas. It's using some really cool like shading tricks to get things to look super smooth. For example, the depth of field in the game. There's presentations on it actually by the core graphics programmer on this, Tomas, and they are just the depth of field looks incredible in this game. It's probably one of the smoothest depth of fields I've possibly ever seen in a video game. And it just generally is a gorgeous little, as I described in the video, cozy core game. And there aren't too many games that are kind of lo-fi that also do such hardcore graphics things. And so I really think I appreciate it. And it also runs pretty darn well too, which is not an easy feat given the graphics workload that we're talking about here. Still runs fine on like a GTX 1060 at 1600 by 900 essentially at 60 FPS. And I think that's an awesome thing that I should definitely celebrate. So I wanted to add in Tiny Glade here into our honorable mentions.
Heck yeah. Next on the list then, and this is a funny one, and I kind of agree with you, Oliver, and you kind of broke this up into two things. It's Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, cutscenes, and then the Pro patch. And when you say that, like, I instantly know exactly what you mean, because these cutscenes are among the best real-time cutscenes I think I've ever seen in a game. Like, they are phenomenal, and they do these large-scale sequences where you're just like, wow, how the heck did they do this? This is so cool. And then there's the Pro patch, of course, which basically fixed the image quality woes in a big way because it was really gnarly before that. But the rest of the game, it's good looking with a giant asterisk.
Massive
asterisk.
Sometimes, yeah.
I mean, those cutscenes, they're really great looking. I think that's because Square Enix has some of the best animators and CG artists in the business, and they're really great at creating like really exciting action sequences in particular, really exciting dialogue sequences as well, and it all looks very beautiful because they can kind of fake things to some degree. Like, you don't need to have like a really strong systemic GI system to have good looking GI in cutscenes necessarily, or good 3-point lighting in cutscenes, and make that look appealing, I think. And you have full control over everything, and those sequences like really do look like up there with some of the best stuff in games. Although I will say they do dip into CG a couple times, and in those sequences it's kind of like those look really something. Sometimes they make the rest of the game not look as flattering. Overall, the game has certain issues, namely with lighting in particular, kind of various lighting issues. They're not relying on light maps nearly as much as the prior game did, which I think flattered the prior game to a large degree, although the larger scope of this title really makes it inappropriate. Then there's the PS5 Pro patch, and basically it like fixes the game in terms of image quality. Like on base PS5, it looks like 1080p like there, subjectively speaking, even though it's a little higher res typically. In the versatility mode on PS4 Pro or PS5 Pro, it's basically very sharp, 4K like, using PSSR. There are some issues with it, like there's a little bit of flicker here and there. There's some moire on like fences and things like that. Some shimmering, foliage is noise perfect, but it's like really sharp, really clear. It's, in my mind, maybe the biggest PS5 Pro upgrade, certainly up there in terms of PS5 Pro upgrades. And on top of that, in my analysis, it also runs at a smoother frame rate. So before, in the performance mode, it could drop sometimes. Those drops are almost completely ironed out on PS5 Pro. So it's just like a really sublime upgrade, and I think elevates the game to a level where I'm actually really comfortable like recommending it on PS5 Pro, Whereas before, I felt like that choice between like basically 1080p 60 or 4K 30, subjectively speaking, imagery, was just a really hard choice. And now it's much, much easier.
Yeah, especially with the lack of camera motion blur, right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
With the 4K 30 mode in the old version, where it's bizarre because they have it on the animations themselves, and it's also in the cutscenes. But for some reason, they decide to turn it off for gameplay, which here or there, it should maybe be a user option. And this one, I'll agree with the honorable mention, mainly just because of the cutscenes, which are very well done. But I felt like watching Oliver's video, I was just like shaking my head at parts. I was like, I don't understand why they made that decision, but there we are.
That's why it's on the honorable mention list, because there's some cool looking stuff in there. But one last one I want to throw in there, just sort of a something that's a little unexpected, perhaps, and it's the Power Rangers game, Rita's Rewind, so this was made by Digital Eclipse, right? And it is essentially a 2D pixel art brawler. And when you look at the normal pixel art stuff, it's actually beautiful. It's well animated. It's really, really cool. But then throughout the game, there are stages that are based on like pseudo 3D graphics, where it's using like complete sprite scaling. And it turns out that Mike Micah himself from Digital Eclipse essentially wrote an old school scalar type engine very specifically to simulate that look in a way that, with a lot of modern engines, you can kind of fake this stuff with like billboards and cards and like, you're kind of still using 3D technology to simulate it. But here, this is legit old school 80s style super scaling action. And apparently it was even challenging for them to sort of like get the art pipeline sorted, because artists are just not used to making graphics in the way that you need to make graphics for this thing to work. Right. But the end result is honestly just striking. It looks so cool in motion, and they do so much with it. And it's a big portion of the game. And it's just having all these independent 2D sprites all scaling together just creates this it's like mesmerizing, and I think it's genuinely beautiful on its own terms. They also do this cool thing. Another effect that's worth mentioning, they do this both in the 3D and the 2D, is these time rift things where like they bring out something to like mess with time, and if you don't destroy it fast enough, it rewinds time, and so like the whole game sort of like rewinds back maybe like 10 seconds. But they do this very cool like kind of effect with it that I'm not really seeing in a 2D game that just looks cool. So it doesn't obviously make the top 10 list. It's not like super technically demanding here, but I thought it was a neat example of a very old school way of drawing graphics that really, really looks cool. Plus, they did an awesome job with the CRT shaders. Like really, really, really great job with them. The only downside there is that it kind of defaults to it when you first boot the game, which is awesome, unless you're like creating video for YouTube, in which case people should probably have turned that off, but they often did not. And CRT shaders don't work well on YouTube.
Especially if you're publishing a video at 1080p or something.
Yeah, because the problem is that YouTube window scales arbitrarily to different devices and sizes, right? So you don't get that. You need like pixel perfect scaling for it to work correctly, and you don't get that.